1981. A husband and father returns to his family and his home in West Berlin, only to discover that his wife wants a divorce. She won't tell him why, but she's desperate to leave.
But it's difficult, don't you understand? It is difficult. I didn't want it to happen, but it happened, and now... But don't you come any closer!
Someone or something seems to be luring her away and making her behave very strangely. Upon investigating what's really happening to his wife and where she's disappearing to every time she leaves the flat, this man finds his world being turned upside down as he slowly sinks into a violent, mind-altering nightmare. Join me as we continue our journey through the mind and body, and we discuss Andrzej Żuławski's Possession.
Well, that's why I'm with you. Because you say I for me.
Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. This series, we are exploring the mind and body in horror cinema, and this is part 9, in which, as the intro suggested, we're going to be talking about that bonkers film from 1981, Possession. Oh God, so much to get through. I think we'd better get straight into it. Joining me to discuss all things Possession, one of my most frequent regular guests on the podcast. She is the co-host of her own podcast, The Final Girls, and she is the perfect person to speak to when it comes to this particular strange, mind-blowing dance horror film. It is my great pleasure to welcome back to the podcast, Anna Bogutskaya. Hello, Anna.
Hello. Thanks for having me, even remotely.
I know. How's lockdown life for you?
It's been shit, Mike. It's been real shit.
Fair.
No, I mean, I can't complain. I'm very blessed in many ways, and I've been counting my blessings. But I mean, let's not beat around the bush. It's shit. It's really shit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you been getting in lots of kind of film watching and TV binging and that kind of thing? Because I found it's been a good time for that.
To be honest, no. And it's weird. I've written about this actually because I found it's better now. But in the first maybe month or two of lockdown, I literally could not get through a single film.
That's interesting.
Unless it was something really bad and I was kind of, jokingly texting with someone. So not really watching.
Yeah.
TV, everything. I binged so many shows that I had watched already, shows that I had been meaning to watch. But films, I literally could not sit through anything that I had not seen before. So I was rewatching a lot. But I found it really hard to concentrate on new stuff, which is obviously problematic for me.
It's hard, but also a big part of what you do is you're a programmer, you run festivals, you must be really missing that, watching stuff with other people, right?
Oh, absolutely. Like, I've already come to terms with the fact that I'm not going to go to the cinema for the rest of 2020. And that's an extremely depressing fact, considering that I literally will get anxious if I'm not in a cinema screen at least once a week.
Yeah.
Like, that's my happiest place. It's my safe space.
Totally. I was trying to work it out, and I think this is probably the longest I've ever not been in a cinema since I was probably about 16, Like I think ever since I kind of went to university onwards, I was always going to see a film in a cinema at least once every couple of weeks or once a month,
Oh my God, yeah. I think this is probably the most that I haven't been. My last cinema experience was in March, and it was a fantastic one. Maybe just a week or so before lockdown happened.
Yeah.
And I've not been to the cinema since then, obviously. And I think this is probably the longest period since I was about 8.
Yeah.
Because I grew up really close to a cinema, so I would just be there all the time.
Oh, it's sad times. Let's pray normality returns soon. So I want to ask you, first of all, Anna, before we get into this week's film, I mean, the theme for this series, it's mind and body, so very much kind of the horrors from within. What are your thoughts on this area of the horror genre?
Oh, I love the way you put it, the horror from within.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah.
No, I love it. I thought it's such a good idea, and I think it would have been really easy to just do psychological horror, body horror, and I think what's interesting about the way that you're framing this season of the podcast and kind of the interesting part about body horror is that a lot of people can think that body horror is just, blood and guts and bodies being gross. And there is a lot of that. But actually what that taps into are deep-seated psychological taboos and anxieties. So actually it's a lot about the things that we're afraid of. And anxiety is the driving force behind horror. It's one of the reasons why I think we all instinctively connect with it.
Yeah.
And it's an incredibly anxious time right now.
Oh my God. Yeah. Totally.
So it's incredibly appropriate.
I mean, actually, so many films weirdly have kind of felt very apt. Like we talked about Repulsion, this story about this woman being on her own in a London flat, and, all of these. Yeah, Anna's got her hand up. Exactly. Like we've all had a little repulsion moment here and there, I think, in lockdown, haven't we?
That's having
the
thing. 3 months of repulsion.
And I think you're right. Last week we talked about The Brood, and in some ways you'll always think of that as a body horror, but in some ways it is just as much psychological, right? And I think that we're finding more and more, and I'm sure especially we'll talk about this with Possession as well, that the two are kind of the same thing, really, aren't they? Like you say, body horror often comes from anxiety or depression or something, something psychological.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think The Brood is a really interesting conversation because we've just done that on the Final Girls podcast as well with Tara Judah, and she brought up so many interesting points about how that film in particular is always thought about as body horror because of who Cronenberg is and what his filmography is.
Yeah.
But actually its themes are incredibly sociological and psychological.
Totally.
So it's much more about people's personalities and the way that they deal with situations that are tense than it is about bodies being gross.
Yeah,
although there is a lot of that.
There is a lot of that. That's very true. Let's get into it then, shall we? We've got quite a lot to discuss, I think, with this film. So let's begin our discussion of Andrzej Żuławski's Possession from 1981.
Oh, Mark, your wife keeps her own secrets.
Make her talk to me. It'll be the way that she wants. Tell me.
Well, I think what you want to do to Bob is just
Inhuman. So what you're doing must be human. What's gonna happen to us?
after you!
Stop coming!
Why I have to go?
I'll follow you! You can hate me as
Anna,
much as
first
you
of all,
like.
simple question. Question one, what's the plot of Possession?
What? No. That is
No.
a trick question, and I will not pander to it. No, I honestly, when we were emailing about this beforehand, I was thinking about it. I was like, oh, I'm going to do my homework. I literally could not tell you what this film is about. Okay, so on the surface, it is about a couple breaking down. It's about the marriage between Mark and Anna. They've been estranged. Mark is some sort of spy who's back from a mission. Essentially, he is a man who's been away from home for quite a long time. What he does, the sort of work that he does, is kind of irrelevant. There's going to be a lot of that in this film. There's the details are kind of irrelevant. It's all about the mood and the atmosphere and how the characters are reacting. And Anna, his wife, he comes back to her and basically she asks for a divorce. So in a very, very succinct way, Possession is a film about a marriage breaking down.
Yeah.
In a bigger, expansive way, it's about a marriage breaking down and then them discovering that actually it's not because of a pedestrian love affair. It's because of some weird supernatural monster thing that Anna is potentially having an affair with, and it sort of has a intense psychological effect on all of them.
Yes, exact. Very well put.
Does that cover it?
I think that covers it. That's perfect. And I'm really glad that you said what you said about how, there is this going on with the plot and there's this going on with the plot, but that kind of doesn't really matter. And I'm glad you said that, because I find myself when I watch it going, am I supposed to be understanding everything that's going on here? Or am I supposed to be thinking that the fact that he's a spy has some sort of relevance to what's going on? Is this actually all about the Cold War? Is this about Berlin torn in two? There are so many things. This film feels like it's so bursting at the seams with ideas, doesn't it? That actually it kind of makes my head explode a little bit, you know?
I mean, if it didn't, I think I would be really scared of you. Just be like, are you a psychopath if this makes complete sense to you? Yeah, exactly. So first of all, just to ask you simply, what do you think of the film? Are you a fan of it? Oh my God, yes, I love it. Mm-hmm. Absolutely love it. And I love it kind of for the same reasons that you were just describing. It's because of the fact that it's a film that's a chameleon.
Yeah.
I love those types of films. It's a film that's so dense and layered that when you approach it, when you watch it, and how you watch it, and who you are when you watch it, has a massive effect on the way that you interpret it. So the film that I saw when I first saw Possession was not the film when I saw Possession for the second time, was not the film that I saw last night when I was rewatching it for this podcast. So that's my interpretations, and the things that kind of surface in the film have really shifted. And I love those types of films because those are the ones that merit rewatching and they merit kind of revisiting. And I think it's one of those films, the reason I think that primarily it's been kind of so has kind of gained a cult following and people keep talking about it and keep thinking about it and either really revile it or find it really dense and rich with ideas, is because it is sort of shifting. Like, you can see it as so many things and it kind of works on all of those levels. I don't think there's any one person who can say definitively this is what this film is, because it's about 10 or 12 different films in one.
It really is. What did you think then, the most recent time you watched it, for example? What did you see in it this time round, or what did you think this film was about to you the most recent time that you watched it?
Well, interestingly, this time round, so this was probably would have been my third time watching it.
Yeah, same.
This time around, the relationship aspect really stood out to me. It was all about kind of all the supernatural stuff. Those were the bits that really kind of spoke to me the loudest. It was about this extremely intense, almost very theatrical, very visceral yelling and breaking down of a relationship, of a marriage, of these people who physically could not stand each other, but also were too attached to really separate fully.
Yes.
Like, they kept getting drawn back in together, even though it was toxic and hurting them. And they kind of hated each other and hated each other's guts and couldn't stand being around each other. But they kept kind of gravitating back. And kind of that self-destructive relationship was the thing that really stood out to me. And then, the Lovecraftian fuck monster and things are kind of probably the things that I was like gravitated towards when I first saw it on a VHS in art school or something. It's like, oh, this is one of the weirdest horror films ever made. And you sort of gravitate towards that aspect. And then I viscerally remember seeing it for the second time because it was at the Anthology Film Archives in New York on a 35mm print.
Oh, wow.
So it was like a very film nerdy experience. I was like, yes, let's see what the camera, what is he trying to tell me with the camera movements in this scene, and why there's so many weird extended close-ups, and what is the Isabella Gianni's look to the camera mean? It was very analytical about it. And this time it was a lot more of an emotional reading of these characters who are, and I think maybe because there's been quite a few very interesting takes on kind of divorce and the breakdown of relationships, and because I had The Brood in my mind as well, and that is very much also a divorce movie. Yes. Very much a divorce movie, and kind of Marriage Story, which I loved from last year.
Also Midsummer, right? I thought of Midsummer, which we've talked about together, like the ultimate kind of breakup horror as well. And I think you're right. I had the exact same thing as you. I always think of this in my head as you put it, the Lovecraftian fuck monster film. And it's really not. I think it's over an hour in before we see that monster. And this film is exactly like you said. This time watching it, I was really struck by how this was just almost like a kind of kitchen sink drama about this domestic space and about this marriage breaking down, right? Which in itself is really horrific and hard to watch, actually.
Absolutely.
I'm almost grateful for the kind of genre stuff when that starts to creep in halfway through, because that the kind of screaming and the level of intensity that these scenes get to, especially in the first half with those two in their apartment together, it's quite unbearable, isn't it?
Oh my God, yes. Especially when they're kind of arguing and they're trying to kind of pick apart why they cannot work together.
Yeah.
And you know nothing good is going to come out of it. But they
Yeah.
just keep picking and picking until they're just ready to literally either kill one another or kill themselves.
Yes.
Which they sort of try. And there's a really visceral... Before we meet the Lovecraftian fuck monster even, there's a really visceral scene in the kitchen where they're arguing, and it gets to the point where Isabella Gianni's character, Anna, tries to slice open her neck with a meat cleaver. And then directly after... Sam Neill's character, Mark, also does the same thing. He just like starts slicing up his arm like it's a ham.
Yeah.
And it's these really static shots, and you're just forced to watch these two people physically and emotionally brutalize each other. And you're like, Jesus, this is scarier now. And maybe it's because we're getting older. It's scarier now than the idea of the monster or some alien or cosmic horror is.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. So maybe we should start then by, let me ask you about those performances. Because again, they're like no other performances that you're likely to see in a mainstream horror film, are they? Sam Neill and Isabella Gianni especially. What do you think of these performances? Do you find them easy enough to watch, I suppose, as performers on screen?
Oh my gosh. Okay. There's like two things there. Do I find them easy to watch on screen? Absolutely. I love both of them. I have all the time in the world for Sam Neill, an underrated horror king.
So much, yeah.
Like, come on, In the Mouth of Madness. I've never seen a man go insane better on screen than Sam Neill.
Yeah.
He's extraordinary.
Totally.
And also everybody thinks of him as, the Dr. Jurassic Park. It's like, no, excuse me.
No, it's Event
so
Horizon, In the Mouth of
Yes.
Madness. In fact, he's very good at these kind of like cosmic Lovecraftian kind of madness horrors. They're all like a similar. They'd make quite a good trilogy, like Possession, In the Mouth of Madness, and what was the other one? Oh, Event Horizon. Yeah, great. I'd be so up for that.
Absolutely. I mean, you might go insane by the end of that triple bill, but worth it.
Worth
And
it. Yeah.
Isabella Gianni, I find magnetic. She is one of those actresses who is completely unhinged on screen. I'm not saying that kind of in a bad way, as in like she's insane, but in a way that she holds nothing back. She acts with her entire face.
Yes.
She acts with her entire body. She is almost like possessed, no pun intended. But and she's been like that when she began her career, kind of and when she was a teenager even. Like one of her breakout roles was The Story of Adele H. in 1975, which was directed by Truffaut, and she was 19, and she also played a woman driven mad by rejection because the man that she was in love with did not reciprocate. And she's got the same level of intensity, not as kind of extreme. It's a period piece and all of this, but her most celebrated roles and kind of part of this the way that she was sort of pigeonholed was in that way, like she'd push herself. She was always going just a smidge too far to be comfortable to look at. Like in a way, she always, I'm really interested in kind of women going mad on screen. And so when you think of people like Catherine Deneuve in Repulsion, she's a very controlled performer. She's not really giving you away
it's very
too
kind
much.
Of, it's introverted, isn't it? Yeah.
But then there's people like Gina Rowlands as well, who, in the work that she did with Cassavetes was also kind of very different from the sort of style of acting that was popular or commercial at that time. And I think Isabella Gianni and Gina Rowlands have a lot to do with one another, because they sort of, in the right role, in a role that pushes them to a limit, they will go very, very far. And I don't know how healthy that is necessarily. There's a lot of rumors about the fact that this performance in particular pushed her to places that were extremely difficult to handle and basically gave her like PTSD. And there's a whole nother separate conversation that can be had about kind of what is the responsibility between a director and an actor of like how far can you push them that doesn't create actually create damage. But what we're seeing on screen, I don't think I've seen a performance as intense and mad. Like for some, even though having seen this film several times, sometimes when I was looking at it last night and kind of revisiting particular scenes this morning, I was like, is she okay?
Yeah.
You want me to believe you?
Oh, yes! Monster. Oh, I fuck her on with everybody. Whenever you turn her on, I fuck her on with everybody! On every corner! You will let me go!
Like, there's a very visceral, like, you feel it in your gut. It almost feels, I don't even think I can like analyze it in intellectual terms, because you just kind of feel it like a gut punch.
Yes.
Like it's going a bit too much or
Yes.
too far. Like you're sort of, like you're almost watching something that you shouldn't be allowed to watch.
100%. Yeah, there's something very kind of unstable about it, isn't there?
Feral.
Feral,
Yeah.
exactly. I was watching it in the same room as Brianna, who's not seen it, but she was doing work, so she was just listening to it. And it was just listening to these like screams and shouts for 2 hours. She was just like, what the fuck is this film? It's like, turn it down, because it was like, it's so overwhelming, actually, this film, isn't it? Just the sound design and what we're seeing on screen and the level of intensity and how long it is. It's quite long for a horror film, isn't it? And it just, every time you think it's gone as manic as it can go and the performances have gone as manic as they can go, it seems to still somehow go further, doesn't it? Absolutely. What about the other performers as well? I'm obsessed with Heinrich.
Oh my God, yes, I was just going to say. I was like, can we talk about Heinrich?
Humanity invents to strangle me. Why don't you like me? Why don't you draw on the plenitude of my love and pour it all over you like fertile rain? Okay, I like you.
What is the deal with Heinrich?
Why does Heinrich hate buttons is what I want to know.
Don't you think he looks a little bit like Anthony Hopkins? I think in my head, he looks like a young Anthony Hopkins with no buttons done up. That's like how I keep picturing.
I mean, that's basically the Mask of Zorro.
Yes.
And that is a vision. No, do you know who you reminded me of? Of Roy Scheider in All That Jazz?
Yes, totally. Well, and this is something, obviously, we have to talk about, Anna, which is that, is there or is there not an element of dance and dance horror in this film?
100%. This is so on my list of dance horror films.
Yeah, it is. It feels like, in some ways, the whole film is like a kind of intense operatic ballet or like theatre experience, doesn't it? I think maybe because of the level of performances or something, but also the movement.
Yeah, do you know what I was thinking about last night when I was watching it? And I had it kind of in the back of my mind. It's like thinking of it as dance horror. It's like, why? Because I hadn't seen it in a few years, since 2015. So it's like looking for the dance in there. And one thing I noticed that kind of made it slightly different from the other dance horror films that we've discussed is kind of the camera movements. Even when the performers, the actors, were not really kind of doing anything that could be interpreted as choreography or dance, or even that kind of, the miscarriage scene, which is very jittery and kind of, her Isabella Gianni flailing around in the subway tunnel.
Yes.
It's all about the camera movements. The camera movements constantly glide. They follow them around. There's very strange cuts that make it seem almost like operatic, like you mentioned, or sort of twisting around or circling around them, even when they're not moving around, which creates a sense of movement that kind of reminds us of dancing in the same way that, say, something like Climax does, but that's playing around with actual performers that are actually dancing and camera movements. But it's always that combination of either really static cameras and kind of moving performers, or in the case of Possession, they're not necessarily dancing, but the camera makes it feel like they are. Because it's just always circling around them and creating the sense of kind of vibrancy. Yeah,
and there's something about the way the performers move around each other too, almost like there's a sense of like theatrical blocking. Like when Sam Neill and Isabella Gianni they almost get into a physical, they do actually get into a physical fight at one point when they're hitting each other. There's something about that again feels like you're watching a play of some sort, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And Heinrich too. I mean, Heinrich literally throughout the whole film, every time we see him, he's dressed as some sort of ballet dancer.
Yeah, like Roy Scheider in All That Jazz.
Yeah.
Literally is the same look.
Exactly. Yep. And very homoerotic as well.
Oh my God, that scene. Okay, so let me put it in contemporary terms. Yeah. Heinrich is the kind of 45-year-old man who goes on Tinder because he has decided he's in an ethically non-monogamous relationship and he will lecture you about the definition of ethical non-monogamy for hours. That is Heinrich in 2020 terms.
I love it. That's so good. It's interesting, actually, you compared this to something like Marriage Story, which I agree with. And one of the things everyone kept talking about with Marriage Story is, you know, is it giving equal amount of time and kind of sympathies to both characters? Is it more on Adam Driver's side than hers? And I just wondered what you think about that in the context of this film. Do you think that or do you personally feel like your sympathies lie with one of these two characters more than another?
To be honest, no. And it's an interesting question because it is like fully a divorce movie. And I think they're both kind of wounded and behave in ugly ways. Yeah. And in very violent ways. And there's a child in the middle as well, which I definitely kind of misremembered myself, maybe because I wasn't paying attention to. I mean, he's not in there, Bob, their child is not in there a lot. And as in many divorce movies, is used very much as a ploy for one character to hold against the other character. Yes. I think what this film does is because we don't really get that much backstory or information, or even this film doesn't really happen in a logical world. Yeah. We kind of are just witnessing raw emotion from both these characters. Yes. It kind of doesn't make sense on paper. Yeah. But when you feel it, it makes sense because you can recognize certain bits that they're just pushed to an extreme. It actually really reminded me of this film called War of the Roses with Kathleen Turner and Michael Douglas. Oh, yeah. Which, again, it's more of a dark comedy, and it's, again, kind of a divorce movie. But it's the ultimate kind of reading of those is that those extreme emotional situations push these people to a point where they're beyond likability or lovability. Yeah. It's kind of just raw nerve. And there's a really powerful scene when they're arguing in the kitchen, when they kind of really shift the power dynamics consistently throughout the film. And you can see that kind of in how disheveled they are. Sometimes even Isabella Gianni will just be kind of like dirty, like her dress will be dirty, she'll be disheveled, she'll look mad like she hasn't slept in 4 days. Yeah. And Sam Neill's character, by contrast, will be extremely poised and kind of calm, and he'll be, say, the sane or the good one in inverted commas here. Again, doing this, which is great podcast content. I know, I always do it as well. Yeah. And then on the other hand, suddenly in the span of 20 seconds, Sam Neill will be the complete opposite. So he'll be completely deranged, off his face on booze, or trying to hurt himself and not really being able to control himself. And Isabella Gianni will be incredibly poised and controlled and kind of commanding. And that constant back and forth makes it both very difficult, and it makes it really difficult to have any sort of allegiance to any of them because they're both behaving in completely mad and insane ways. Yeah. And I think it, again, kind of going back to my initial point, it kind of depends on where you are at. Yeah. That you can either see things that you can recognize and empathize with from both of the characters, even Heinrich, really. Yeah. And then kind of bring that into your experience of the film, or you're just completely gobsmacked because essentially this film is kind of slapping you in the face from both sides, which the characters also do in the film. Yes. They literally just slap each other for a solid minute. I know. Yeah, you're so right. It's really interesting the way the dynamic shifts. And I think perspective too, because I think it sets itself up as being a lot more of like, we kind of introduced as Sam Neill is our kind of way in. Like we see him coming off his job as a spy, coming home. We see him on his own in the house, phoning people, trying to figure out what's going on with his wife. And then at some point, seamlessly in the film, it's suddenly like we're now with Isabella Gianni pretty much until the end of the film, going through all the scenes with her in the subway and her going back to that apartment block. And I think, again, it does it really carefully and seamlessly, I think. Yeah. But then it shifts again, and then we're back again with Sam Neill, and then we're back again with Isabella Gianni, and then it gets really weird. It really does. So and what do you think is their kind of, what is happening to this marriage? Is it that
is it that she basically has just stopped loving him? That she's clearly not like that fussed about Heinrich, is she? It's not like she's necessarily left him for another man, although she's left him for this thing. But is that the reason that she left him in the first place? Or has that happened since? Did she just fall out of love with him? How do you kind of interpret what's happened in this marriage?
I think this time around I saw it kind of as a pretty natural dissolution from both sides.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting dynamic because for a big chunk of the film, she's desperately trying to run away and hurt him in any way. And kind of infidelity and adultery, either with Heinrich, or at one point she yells at him that she's been, sleeping around behind his back with anyone. Essentially, all of those things are designed to kind of hurt his ego, and especially kind of the male ego, really, in that context. And Heinrich is so opposed to the way that Sam Neill behaves as well, that kind of, her having an affair with someone who is so different from her husband is also kind of insulting. And then obviously there's the Lovecraftian fuck monster. It's like, oh, I'm even having an affair with something that's not human. But it's not really an affair. It's essentially kind of running away from all that marriage represents.
Yeah.
The child, him, their house, responsibilities, heteronormativity, kind of behavioral structures, everything. It doesn't matter what it is. You can then also kind of maybe interpret it as, this intense, almost pathological desire that she has for the monster rather than Heinrich, although their relationship is quite interesting because he's quite domineering of her in the one scene that they kind of share in that apartment. And is it kind of an externalized version of something different? Maybe it's like drugs or alcohol, or kind of an external substance that is sort of presented in the film in the form of this monster, as in like something that is monstrous but inescapable for her, that she keeps getting drawn back. And I think part of that was also because of the fact that she is so run down and disheveled, and she keeps going to this place and sort of protecting it and doesn't want anyone to see it, and it has this whole secret separate life. And the way that apartment as well, where she in Kreuzberg, where she goes to be with the monster, where she's keeping the monster, it's also quite like, it looks like a drug den in many ways. There's nothing there. There's just like a dirty mattress on the floor. The monster's like either on the bed or in a corner hiding. And like all the wallpaper is coming down. It's very grimy. So it kind of really reminds us of, to the point where someone is so addicted to something that they don't really care about themselves, their health, their well-being, their surroundings. It's just a matter of being close to that source of the addiction. It's like the addiction monster in American Horror Story terms, right?
Yes, nice reference. You're absolutely right. I think it is. It's like this monster is this almost dirty little secret or something, isn't it? It's she keeps it hidden away, and there's almost a sense of embarrassment and fear when that man comes to the flat for the first time, and she really, really doesn't want him to go in that bedroom and see what's in there. And I mean, of course, because it's gross, but also there is this feeling that, like you say, there's a sense of shame or something. And I do think it's interesting. Of course, there are so many films about marriage breakdowns, and there are probably a lot more films about the husband going through some sort of midlife crisis and wanting out of his mundane domestic life, whether it's American Beauty or God knows what else. But it's actually much more rare, it feels like, for that to be the female half of the story. And again, this idea of this woman who is sort of rejecting that domestic equilibrium and escaping the confines of being a wife and mother is viewed as almost monstrous in this film, isn't it? And it's interesting, isn't it? It's somehow a bit more taboo, the fact that she's rejecting this quote unquote normality and instead embracing this sort of darker, seedier side of life, I suppose.
Yeah. Or is she embracing it, or is she kind of compulsive about it, which I think is also kind of an interesting interpretation of like, what does it look like when a woman who, on the surface has kind of all the right, the right ingredients for a happy life, might not be happy in her marriage. But, there's nothing that really points us to believe that Sam Neill, Mark, is happy in their marriage either.
That's true. Yeah.
But he kind of wants to cling on to it quite desperately, whether she's very ready or completely unable to cling on to it. She's like, no, like compulsively needs to escape and run away and go back to that dingy secret life or secret apartment.
Let me ask you about the character of the teacher as well, who I think is really interesting. Now, she's another character that's played by Isabelle Adjani. And obviously the film later on, as part of this story, we do deal with doppelgangers and doubles. And I'm trying to figure out exactly where the teacher fits in this. I mean, in your opinion, do you think, is the teacher part of this strange Lovecraftian monster thing that can take the form of other people like it does with Sam Neill at the end? Or is there something else here going on with the teacher who just happens to look identical to Anna?
Well, I don't know. I was thinking about it. I was like, and I was watching. The main difference between those characters is that the teacher has these like very intense, bright green contact lenses, right?
Yes.
And then I was noticing that the creature also has these very, when we get a close up of its face, he only has like a very weird mouth and two eyes kind of on the side of his body head that are intensely green as well, very similar in color to the teacher's contact lenses. But I don't think we're really meant to believe that they're one and the same. I think perhaps it's that manifestation of that idea, mainly for the benefit of Sam Neill's character of Mark, of seeing the version of his wife that he imagines.
Yes.
But that's not his wife.
Yes. Yeah.
It's like, oh, it's the same, but it's different. But then again, we might interpret it as maybe he is projecting his wife's likeness onto any woman, because actually he just wants to be with her. So even if he's having an affair with the teacher, or he tries to have an affair with the teacher, he's just imagining that it's his wife.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, because obviously later on at the end of the film, we do see quite literally the Lovecraftian fuck monster turns into a kind of doppelganger for Sam Neill. But I think earlier on in the film, this teacher doppelganger, you know, no one else other than Sam Neill's character seems to acknowledge that she looks identical to Anna.
Yes.
You know, because she interacts with Bob and other characters and nobody seems fussed that she looks identical to her. It's only Sam Neill's character that seems taken aback by it.
And, you know, you could also maybe argue the fact that the monster takes the form of Sam Neill's doppelganger at the end. Is that because Anna is also projecting her husband's likeness onto the monster?
Oh, yeah.
So when it kind of grows into a human form, it takes the form of her husband.
Yes.
Even if she's literally killing her husband.
Yes, exactly. Ooh.
Fucked up movie.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good.
Nothing's gonna happen.
Visualize us sitting in a circle. Spirit, we invite you to use us to pass on any communication. Is there anyone there? Please come forth.
What was that? Amy, was that you?
I heard it. I heard something.
I think there's something here.
Do you see that?
Hello everybody, that was a little clip you just heard there from a film that dropped on Shudder last week and is already being branded the scariest film of 2020, the best horror film of 2020, the definitive horror film of 2020. Dread Central even said it was the scariest film of the last decade. I am of course talking about Rob Savage's found footage horror Host. Host, for those of you who haven't heard of it, it's an incredible feat. It was a movie that was made entirely on Zoom during lockdown by a filmmaker with a bunch of his friends, and it is a truly innovative and frightening horror film. So over on EOH TV, that's our YouTube channel, we have been covering all things Host this week. You can listen to my exclusive interview with the director and the two writers about what it was like to make a horror film during a pandemic. And not only that, I had a little Zoom call with friend of the pod, Louise Blaine, and we deep dived into Host and discussed our thoughts on the film in both spoiler-free and spoilerific detail.
It's the definitive horror film of 2020. Absolutely. This is the horror film of the fact that we're all sitting like giddy kids You stayed up till midnight after someone had gone to bed to watch it. We're all really excited by it. Everyone's telling their friends to watch it. And this is the pandemic equivalent of a blockbuster like Jaws. This is the way we access it. We're accessing it on a horror exclusive streaming service, which I'm really hoping people will then watch other films on, because hey, if nothing else, they've got a week's free trial. But I think it's absolutely a definitive, terrifying pandemic masterpiece, and I'm all for it.
And there we go. If you want to hear more of that discussion, you can. It's absolutely free and it's available right now on YouTube. Head on over to youtube.com/evolution of horror. Subscribe to our YouTube channel because there's tons of other horror video content right there. That's youtube.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to our discussion of Andrzej Żuławski's Possession. Let me ask you, Anna, a little bit about the kind of historical context of what's going on in the background here. Now, I'm not really much of an expert in this. I don't know if you're probably going to know a bit more than I do. But of course, this movie was made in the early 80s and it was filmed in West Berlin. Now, of course, this is kind of in the midst of Cold War, of Berlin being divided in two, of Germany being divided in two, essentially. And it's all going on in the backdrop of this film. And it's not really overtly referenced, apart from the fact that Mark, Sam Neill's character, is some sort of spy potentially, but other than that there's not really any sort of mention of the Cold War. But do you think that backdrop, that social political backdrop, is important to what's going on here in Possession?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's I would argue that it's incredibly intentional, and it's not by any chance Andrzej Żuławski is Polish, and he's filming this film in Berlin. It's set in West Berlin, but it's filmed in West, and it's kind of released at a time at the peak of the Cold War. It would be disrespectful to say that that's unintentional.
Yeah.
But same as you, I'm no expert on history, but I think it's much more than a backdrop. And the way the city of Berlin is filmed this way, the way that both the interiors and the exteriors are filmed, are extremely meaningful.
It's very empty, isn't it? It's very sparse.
It's extremely empty.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very violent, and there's a lot of shots that emphasize kind of that almost forced separation, which you could interpret as essentially what Berlin was being forced to do. Even in the scene when they're having their first conversation in the cafe, when they're sort of, their backs are facing each other and they're kind of looking in opposite directions.
Yes.
And there's a lot of shots like that then where we're kind of seeing in the two really big buildings, that iconic shot from Possession, or they're kind of trying to emphasize the fact that there's no humanity there.
Yes.
But also that both sides of those coins, and maybe the doppelganger theme that comes up kind of ties into this as well. It's a made up separation.
That's exactly it, isn't it? That's it in a nutshell. And I'm sure there is so much that you could say, and I know that obviously there are so many think pieces out there and essays about this film, and about how, like you say, it's a story of a couple torn in two, set in a city that's divided and torn in two. There's loads there to talk about. And actually, speaking of Berlin, another thing that I want to ask you about, is the way in which this film has clearly inspired so many movies. And a recent one that we saw together that I kept thinking of when rewatching Possession was Suspiria, as in Luca Guadagnino's Suspiria, not Dario Argento's. I think there's really something stylistically similar there, isn't it? In fact, I was thinking about it, and really Guadagnino's film is actually, it seems to be taking more from Possession than it did from Argento's original, I think.
Oh, 100%. And, Guadagnino's Suspiria, I think, is also very influenced by Fassbinder, by Rainer Werner Fassbinder.
Yes.
Who is a German filmmaker. And you can see a lot of Suspiria in Possession as well, especially, like I mentioned before, kind of in the way that it films the spaces and the city. It feels like in Possession, you don't really get a sense of Berlin, east or west. You're completely isolated, even in open spaces in the city with these characters. There's barely any people in the street. They're only there if they're there to interact with the characters in some way, whether that's meaningful or not. They're kind of overpowered by these intense brutalist structures. And with Suspiria, with the 2018 version, it's kind of the same. We only really exist in the dance academy, so in these interiors, in the same way as in Possession, we really only exist in the couple's apartment, in the fuck monster's apartment, in Heinrich's apartment for a short, visit. It's all about inside of these houses where all of these very intense, very secretive conversations are happening. There's a really interesting scene where it's with Mark's office.
Yes.
So kind of these office spaces. And the camera there is absolutely mad. The way that it moves around the space and kind of around Mark having this sort of board meeting or debrief or something. But other than that, it seems like they're living in a ghost city.
Yeah, and that camera movement. I mean, there are so many, like you've already mentioned it really. It's almost like the camera dances throughout this film. And again, you've mentioned it already, but climax, there is almost a Gaspar Noé kind of camera movement to this film at times, like this kind of like roaming camera. But also it's very controlled. There's that amazing shot when Sam Neill is in a rocking chair and he's going back and forth and the focus is pulling so that he's constantly in focus as he moves back and forth. It's actually amazing, isn't it? The way this film looks. It's
incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's also these really tight close-ups as well on their faces, which I found really unnerving, especially in the scene where Anna is sort of teaching a ballet class to girls.
Oh, God, yeah.
And she's staring directly into the camera.
Yeah.
It's really chilling.
From now on, she know how much right to sing, and she will. She's got in her to say, I can do as well. I can be better. I'm the best. Only in this case can she become success. Nobody taught me that. Well, that's why I'm with you. Because you say I for me.
That's when my brain starts to hurt at that sort of section of the film, because I'm going, what is the relevance of this dance bit? And there's that moment when she looks down the camera and she says, that's why I want you, because you say I for me. And she says all of these strange things. And I'm constantly like trying to unpick in my brain, like, what does this mean? But it's fascinating.
It's fascinating. It's also a really disturbing scene because she's essentially hurting that little girl.
Oh my God.
But
and it goes on and on and on, doesn't it?
It goes
as well?
on and on and on. And like the camera sort of focuses in on Isabella Gianni's face, who's looking directly into the camera.
Yeah.
And into your soul.
Yeah.
And while this little girl is like screaming, kind of just out of shot, and she's like bending her leg or something.
Yeah.
And she continues screaming. And actually that girl then in that kind of at the end of that scene has a freak out and kind of runs out of the room in not a dissimilar way to the way that Isabella Gianni's character does earlier and then later on in the film.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's that kind of level of mania again, isn't it? And again, they're very much there. There is this, obviously, this dance element of the film anyway, but they're very much putting dance in the text itself, right?
Yes.
I mean, at this point, it's overtly saying like this is a film about dance in some way as well.
Yeah. And Anna is supposed to be a dancer. Like she's clearly presented to us in that scene as a dancer, or at least a former one, and a dance teacher.
It's clearly such an influential film, I think. I feel like you can see, like the films we've already talked about, Suspiria, Climax. Later on in this series, I'm going to be talking about Black Swan. And I think there's the duality in Black Swan. There's the dance, body horror. There's a lot of kind of, I feel like this film has left such a legacy behind it,
Absolutely. Even if it's kind of just in terms of atmosphere and tone, if not kind of directly, because we've mentioned the plot is kind of non-existent. It's more about the mood and the images and the performances.
Definitely. I'm not very familiar with Andrzej Żuławski. I've not seen any of his other work. Are you kind of very familiar with him and the rest of his work at all?
Not much, to be honest.
Yeah.
I don't think I've seen Devil,
right,
which is a film that he made a few years before Possession.
Yeah.
But I'm not that familiar with his work, I must admit. So I don't really know how this falls into his into his body of work.
I know. I'm keen to explore more of his work actually and see how similar it is to this or how much of an outlier this might be. Because again, it's such a strange film. I mean, even though, we've drawn these similarities, actually, in some ways also, there's just nothing else like this film, is there? It's just so bonkers.
I think it's one of those kind of weird outliers, I think, because... Also, this is Isabella Gianni's kind of, I believe, only English language role. So there's kind of, and she won the Best Actress award at Cannes for it. So, that this was also presented kind of at that level. And it's interesting to even think about it as a intellectual horror film. And, this is 1981. This is not when horror films were considered intellectual in any way, shape or form. So it's kind of predating the conversation we've been begrudgingly having for the last couple of years about elevated horror and so on. This is being presented in art house spaces and intellectual film spaces, and has one of the stars of French cinema at the time, or of European cinema at the time, going completely insane and having sex with a monster on screen.
It's amazing.
So it's amazing, but it's also like the sort of thing that doesn't quite make sense in the narrative of Żuławski's or Johnny's careers at that point.
Yeah.
Which I think is part of the appeal. It's the fact that it's this weird film that gained a lot of controversy at the time and has sort of remained in circulation, and has always kind of, then with the internet and everything, kind of there's these peak moments of it, like the scene in the tunnel.
Yes, which we'll get to,
the scenes with the creatures, the kind of really heightened scenes, which then continue elevating it, even, as we all have different interpretations and different conversations around it. It's just always going to be very up there in so many ways.
It's really interesting. It's something we've been talking about a lot this series specifically, actually. I think it's that weird blur of art house with genre, and it definitely coincides with these kind of mind and body movies we've been exploring. So, whether it's Repulsion or Eyes Without a Face, Eraserhead, these movies have... for some reason, a little bit more critical clout, I think, maybe because they deal with more psychological, existential states or something. But they seem to belong on that strange blurred line somewhere between genre and art house,
Yeah, and it's interesting as well about like how these films are positioned at that time. Like Eyes Without a Face is part of the French Fantastique. So the French didn't really have a massive history of horror per se, but they do have an incredibly rich history of fantastique cinema, which sort of sits in between sci-fi and horror. And we now claim it as horror, but it wasn't necessarily positioned as such. And it was Georges Franju, who was very respected and was kind of, a respected director and practitioner. Eraserhead was just mental experimental film. We now claim it as horror. I don't think that kind of went down as a horror film in those circles at that time. And you can argue that about a lot of films, even if we think about contemporary stuff, Midsommar being called a breakup movie, or Hereditary, which we also spoke about, being called like a family tragedy.
Yeah.
Get Out being called a social thriller. But Us being very clearly defined as a horror film. Kind of the way that the filmmakers position those films within genre as well is very interesting. I mean, it's relevant. That said, the way that then audiences or us then reinterpret those films is the afterlife. Like, that's the second life of the film. You can intend it as one thing and people will interpret it as another. In the same ways, we spoke about The Brood. Cronenberg very actively was like, this is my Kramer versus Kramer. This is my divorce movie. And people at that time and years later were like, body horror.
Yeah.
Basic.
Yeah.
Not enough body horror to be body horror, so it's a failed body horror. You know what I mean? So it kind of also depends, the way that people judge a film depends on how you position it. And at the time of the release, Possession was quite badly received by critics. So that I also quite find interesting.
Well, that's it, isn't it? It's so interesting when you get films like this that kind of straddle multiple genres or don't really belong in a single genre. What happens is that you could end up winning over both a genre audience and an art house audience, or you risk alienating both audiences, don't you? Because a lot of horror audiences might go and see Possession and they might go, what the fuck is this? You know, I have to wait for nearly an hour into the movie before I see any monsters.
Yeah, I'm not enough fuck monster for horror people.
Exactly. Or, you know, then there's also the kind of highbrow audience that go to Cannes Film Festival and might see this and be like, what the hell? What is this creature feature that I'm sitting through? You know, this isn't what I was expecting at all. So again, I think Possession sits in a really uncomfortable place, and I think it really challenges and it makes audiences feel uncomfortable.
Well, because it's really challenging to go into a film that's asking so much of you and spending 2 hours with a film where you don't really know what you're getting into.
Yeah.
Because you can sell this film. If you've never seen this film, I can describe it to you as a psychological horror about a marriage breaking down.
Yeah.
Or if you don't like dramas and you just like horror films, I'm like, oh, this is a Lovecraftian cosmic horror film with a giant fuck monster. That's disgusting.
Yeah.
Or it's be like, oh, this is Isabella Gianni's woman under the influence.
Yes.
You know, this is her peak unhinged performance. You need to watch it for that. So there's so many entry points into the film, and it kind of depends on how you present it to an audience. Like I'd be incredibly curious to see what somebody who's never seen this film, never heard anything about it, never seen a scene from it, how they experience this film when they don't have any particular framework or nobody sold it to them in a particular way.
Well,
that would be incredible.
I agree, because it's even the title is really clever in that regard, right? Because possession could mean so many things. And the first thing I would think of in my horror brain, I'm sure the first time I ever heard of the film Possession, I would have thought it would have been an Exorcist type possession film, right? But
yeah, totally.
Is that really what the title is talking about? Who knows? You know, I guess it could mean one of several different things, but it's really interesting. And like you say, maybe nowadays, some of the more iconic moments are those more horror-tinged moments. The monster, the subway scene, the front cover of the Blu-ray even is the woman with kind of like tentacles over her. So they push that horror aspect in the marketing. Mm-hmm. But actually, yeah, is it even that? I don't know. It takes so long to get to that stuff. It's really interesting. So let me ask you then about that iconic scene, the subway scene. What do you think of that scene, and what is happening here? Is it that she's having a miscarriage? Is there something else going on here? What is going on?
I mean, who the fuck knows? Like, okay, so it's interesting how these things remain in your brain, right? Because I don't know about you. I'd be curious to know how you remembered this scene. Because I did not remember that she was having a miscarriage. Mm-hmm. I remember the scene very well. And I always thought about it as sort of almost like a possession scene. Like that was the breaking point where like something took control over her. And that's the moment where, you know, her infidelity or the breaking point of their marriage started. And this was just a very elevated dance horror way of expressing it, you know, the emotional breakage from the marriage and how that felt, you know, the emotional pain of that. There's another way to look at it now, which is, you know, she's literally having a miscarriage, and her extreme performance in that scene is kind of a way of making very obvious a pain that is very often not allowed to be seen on screen, definitely, but also is very different for anyone. You know, it's in cinema, we're very used to seeing kind of women in labor and all those images, right, of kind of the pain of giving birth and whatnot. But you're never going to see kind of the hidden invisible pain of a woman's body, and there's a lot of it. You know, female bodies, like cisgendered female bodies, and are a constant source of pain throughout anyone's life. And there's a lot of conversation going on about kind of illnesses and afflictions and pain that women suffer that are not taken seriously and that are not believed because, you know, you can't see them. And it's interesting to think about the scene through that lens of like this woman going completely mad in the scene And could you interpret it as potentially a way of externalizing what internal pain feels like? And the fact that sort of she has this almost alien-like miscarriage that's so extreme, you know, it doesn't necessarily instantly conjure, like that doesn't look like a realistic portrayal of a woman having losing a child. But it's a very emotional approach to that. You know, she's kind of bleeding and oozing goo from her ears, from her mouth, from everywhere. She just ends up in this like gross puddle of bodily fluids that seem very alien. And it almost feels like an emotional scene as opposed to a realistic one, because she's also narrating it, she's describing it, and we're seeing the images. But technically in that scene, she is talking about her miscarriage in a past tense to Mark. So she's kind of describing to him that happened and he didn't know about it because he was away. So she's recounting her emotional memory of that scene as opposed to what actually happened.
Oh, I love that. That's so true, isn't it? It's visualizing it's visualizing a memory is what that scene is doing. Yeah. And it links really nicely to what we were saying, you know, the Brood as well, doesn't it? And this idea of kind of internal states being made external in some way. Or even, you know, your whole series, the whole thing about mind and body and kind of body horror. It's kind of this, what would it look like? You know, what it would look like to see someone's, I'm thinking now of David Cronenberg's The Fly. It's like, what would it look like to see someone's hubris kind of completely take over them and numb them and blind them to seeing what's actually happening and what's becoming of them? It would look like a giant man turning into a fly. Disgusting. Yeah, exactly. I love it. Yeah, and it's so true. It's a difficult scene to watch, that subway scene, because again, you forget how long it goes on for.
It's so long.
And I think you're right. I think I'm sure it's deliberate too, that it does look like some sort of demonic possession to begin with as well. It really does look like she's almost copying Linda Blair's movements in The Exorcist sometimes, when she's like flinging her body backwards and forwards and screaming and that kind of thing. So I'm sure it's all kind of like rounded off into the same thing, isn't it? This idea of possession and the supernatural element, but also the body element and the psychological element, and the fact that it's, this emotional trauma that she's kind of reliving as she's telling this story. It's extraordinary and really like squishy and gooey.
Gross.
I know, gross. Amazing. Well, we're going to wrap this chat up shortly, although we've still got some key things to discuss. But first of all, I thought this would be a good opportunity to head over to our new regular segment, Wild About Horror. Let's see what Freudian cinephile Mary Wild thinks of Andrzej Żuławski's Possession.
Hey Mike, Mary Wild here again. And I'm eager to talk about the notorious 1981 cult psychological horror film Possession by Andrzej Żuławski. It was filmed in Berlin and debuted at the Cannes Film Festival, where Isabella Gianni deservedly won the award for Best Actress. The film was described by Variety as a veritable carnival of nosebleeds. Possession starts on a hysterical note, stays there, and surpasses it as the film progresses. The plot obliquely follows the breakdown of a relationship, portraying the painful emotions and violent impulses of an estranged husband and wife. Żuławski stated that he wrote the screenplay in the midst of a messy divorce, that Possession is his most personal and autobiographical project. He said that he makes films about what disturbs and tortures him, and the woman here serves as a medium. He only wants to tell stories which have something excessive about them. We see Gianni's character, Anna, growing increasingly out of control. The object of her infidelity is not even human, it's an octopus-like monster. She is possessed by this evil, all-consuming force taking over her body, mind, and soul. The iconic scene in Possession is, of course, what takes place in the subway. It's a terrifying transformation in real time. What we see in the subway, psychoanalytically, can be perceived as the body of the Freudian hysteric functioning as a theater, where repressed desires are assigned special roles in order to convey, via physical symptoms, something unspeakable. In the Freudian theory of hysteria, the body becomes a medium of psychological expression precisely because ordinary language no longer suffices to adequately communicate what's happening within. Hysteria is a catch-all diagnosis for a long list of symptoms: emotional excesses, loss of self-control, catatonia, loss of voice, vision abnormalities, deafness, seizures, and convulsions. Hysteria is understood as a conversion of psychological stress into physical symptoms or a change in self-awareness, such as the fugue state or selective amnesia. Symptoms are commonly accepted as being caused by unconscious attempts to ward off anxiety. There's no physiological basis here, so that's why they're called psychosomatic. In a letter to his colleague Joseph Breuer, Sigmund Freud reported that one of his patients was at a loss to find words, and the difficulty gradually increased. With time, she became almost completely deprived of words and put them together laboriously out of 4 or 5 languages, and then became almost unintelligible. In spite of making great efforts to speak, the patient was unable to say a single syllable. Signifiers here seemed trapped inside, the words forced under house arrest within the hysteric's body. These banished words, the things that the subject finds difficult to articulate, gain potency as they roam around, possessing various parts of her. Instead of a wandering womb, it's actually the forbidden signifier that wanders, seeking expression. The hysteric is haunted and possessed by demons of repressed trauma. And if we observe closely, we find that the nature of symptoms reveals the origin of the trauma. In Possession, Anna's subway breakdown is preceded by her visit to a church, where she appears conflicted about her faith. Later on, when she reflects on her seizures, Anna says that it was a miscarriage of faith. Linking this with bodily fluids oozing out of her body, faithlessness is symbolized as the erotic element of her marriage leaving her. And she's later depicted in an embrace with a nightmarish monster. This is a horror projection of the director, the image he holds of his romantic rival, the abject dimension that represents his wife's marital indiscretion. Freudians believe that the hysteric feels everything, stores sensations in the body, fashioning them into future symptoms. The body is thought of as a warped communication device. The hysteric's symptoms do all the talking for her. Sometimes hysterical theater is conceptualized as a seance, where ghosts of the past are brought into a strange light. The hysteric is a medium enabling the transition of absence into physical manifestation. And this is always a type of conjuring. Irrepressible phantoms and demons return from the distant past and are brought into a performance and acting out in the present time. This perfectly captures what's going on in the Possession subway scene. Anna is performing physically what she cannot say verbally. The dramatic skill involved in the continuous evocation of past relationships only lives on in its theatrical rendering, and the self here is a sacrificial host. Anna's apparent self is to be found in her performance. It's also worth adding that the hysteric structure is not really gendered. It's spoken about almost exclusively in female terms because that was the majority of Freud's cases in Vienna. They were mostly women. But men are not immune to hysteria. Freud actually believed himself to be a hysteric because he displayed physical symptoms that seemed to be rooted in emotional issues, such as compulsive cigar smoking, fainting spells, and recurring dreams. Until next time.
A big thank you to the incredible Mary Wilde. I love hearing her takes on these movies every week. And don't forget, if you want to hear more from Mary, you can check out her Projections podcast. You can find that on all places where you get your podcasts. And you can also follow her on Twitter at PsychStar to hear about her upcoming courses and other events. So, Anna, there is one key element of this film that we still haven't really talked about, and that is the Lovecraftian fuck monster. And I can't believe we're nearly an hour into our chat. This is like the running time of the film almost before we mentioned it.
I'm sure you've engineered this.
I have.
It's perfect timing.
Let me ask you, what do you think of that? It's like midway into the film, suddenly we're revealed this thing. Do you remember when you first watched it? when you first saw the film, did you know that this element was going to come into it? Did you know that this is what you were in for, that there was going to be this Lovecraftian cosmic horror that suddenly kind of invades through this marriage story?
To be honest, I think I did. Because I think that's kind of how... I think I saw this film pop up on horror lists and in books. And that was the thing that everybody talked about in those lists. You know, this is one of the weirdest films ever made because of this. However, if you go into the film with that at the forefront, it can seem underwhelming because we don't actually see that much of the Lovecraftian fuck monster.
No, not at all. No.
What we see is enough. Like there's plenty. But also it's a monster that's very inactive. Like he's not really doing anything. He's not really a threat. And when we first see him, actually, it's about 40 minutes in. We see him not kind of in action. We don't see him fully. We sort of see him in the shadows. It's when she first kills Zimmerman, the detective that's following her. So Zimmerman sees the monster and she murders Zimmerman. And then kind of when we fully see him is when he's sort of on the bed because, you know, he's tired from having sex with her all night. And he's like, and she literally says these words. It's like, he's a bit tired.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, wow, okay. I definitely forgot that line of dialogue.
I love it. I know.
But it's like, it's really emphasizing the sexual nature of it, you know, which is, you know, we've been joking for like an hour now about the Lovecraftian fuck monster, but that's basically the best definition of it. It is this inhumanly shaped creature that at one point in that close-up that I described before, we do see like a mouth and two eyes, but we're also led to believe through all these kind of hidden shots of the monster until we kind of see it with kind of having sex with Isabella Gianni's character. We don't really know what the shape or form of it is. We just kind of get these glimpses. I mean, it looks very gooey. There's like a lot of tentacle limb action going on, but we don't really get like a shape, you know, like it's not a thing that we can see. It's like, oh, okay, so this is like an octopus thing. It isn't. We don't really know. And that's kind of what makes it Lovecraftian. It's the fact that we are imagining it, but it's almost too monstrous for us to have a final form, as in we're not entirely psychologically able or capable of seeing its true form. So actually we mainly see it through its relationship with Anna and the way that she sort of protects it and describes it, the way that she talks about it, the way that she sort of maneuvers around it. And then the way that they are kind of when we see them together. And then the creature is almost like evolving because by the end of it, this monster takes the shape of a human man. He takes the shape of Sam Neill. So that implies that there's been like an evolution of this monster changing form. So actually, all the forms that we see of it are subtly and not so subtly different. You know, it changes. It doesn't really have that many tentacles when we first see it. It doesn't really have eyes the first time we see it, and then it does have green eyes. So it's unfathomable. Like, I'm probably mispronouncing that, but like we can't really see it, which makes it terrifying because essentially we see enough to create a picture in our head, and whatever we create in our head, especially us horror nerds, will be so much more terrifying than anything anyone can put on a screen. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's that classic Lovecraftian thing of it's incomprehensible, isn't it? That even when you see people's reactions when they walk into that room and see it, they can't quite comprehend what they're looking at. There's this kind of bafflement as well as horror. I love it. I think it looks really good. And I think just from a practical perspective, not showing it too much also makes it look great. Like it's kind of in the shadows. You see a tentacle, you see an eye. You know, I think it looks really cool. It still really holds up, I think, in that regard, you know? Totally. Yeah, I'm always, I always prefer when they hide the monster a bit rather than overshow it. Because also, you know, on a very practical level, effects age very quickly. And, you know, part of the reasons why things like The Thing remain so intensely effective is because they kind of don't look like anything we've seen before or since. and definitely didn't look like anything anybody has seen before at the time that they were made.
Totally. What an incredible time. It's something we've talked about quite a lot on the podcast, you know, this little era, sort of late 70s, early 80s, where you had, like you mentioned, The Thing. There's also American Werewolf in London. Of course, Ridley Scott's Alien. I mean, next week on this series, we're going to be talking about Videodrome. I kind of imagine that in this same bubble of incredible artistic innovation and practical effects that have just aged incredibly well. They're kind of ageless in a way. And actually another film that is similar to that, which I think also shares a lot of similarities to Possession, is Clive Barker's Hellraiser, which of course comes out a few years later, and we're covering it in a few weeks' time. Yeah. But of course this story, this quite Lovecraftian monster that lives upstairs in this house, and we've got this main female character who is luring men into this room, killing them in order for this unspeakable monster to kind of rebuild himself as a doppelganger of her husband. So I think there's something really interestingly similar there, and I wonder if Hellraiser was actually inspired at all by Possession.
Oh, 100%. Hellraiser is all about Julia. Julia, who's the woman you're talking about. She's like the main villain of Hellraiser 1. And it basically, not to preempt your conversation that I'm looking forward to, it's like, it's all about Julia like wanting to have sex with her ex-lover who happens to be dead and then rebuilds himself from a droplet of blood on the floor.
Exactly. And there's definitely a few possession elements in Hellraiser, I think, as well.
Yeah,
I think
except the dance bits.
Except for the dance bit. It's a slightly more straightforward version of what we're seeing here in Possession. Yeah.
Don't open. But I want to. Don't open. Don't open. Don't open. Don't open. Please don't open. Don't open it.
So finally then, let me ask you about the ending. It's that strange ending. We've got the teacher at home looking after Bob, and then this doppelganger of Sam Neill comes to the door. Bob seems to know that something's wrong. He says, don't open the door. He goes upstairs and just what looks like drowns himself in the bath while we hear, I think, what sounds like bombs dropping or something outside. What do you make of the ending? How do you interpret that ending?
I genuinely have no idea, dude. There's so many things. The Bob and Helen parts of the ending remain quite baffling to me.
Yeah.
I don't think that Bob drowns himself. I think he's playing. But obviously that's my interpretation, and maybe that's wishful thinking, that I don't want the child in this film to kill himself.
Yeah.
The kind of the bit with Anna and Mark I find a little bit more straightforward within the narrative of, you know, the monster has been sort of adapting or growing or regenerating or generating a body that's more that gives him better tools to navigate in society, but he is still kind of otherworldly.
Yes.
And he takes the shape of Mark, which is very, you know, dense thematically speaking, and it's quite interesting, and we've spoken about it. But the fact that Mark and Anna kind of end up together in many ways, you know, like they essentially kill each other, again, kind of really takes me back to War of the Roses. And it's this idea of, you know, they're drawn to each other, but they're also pulling away, and their marriage is completely broken down, but they're still attached at the hip, you know, when it's a very beautiful way of ending their story. And it also shows that that's kind of a connection, like a real connection, where there's the monster that takes the shape of Sam Neill at the end. He just runs away. He runs away. He's not there to save Anna. He's not there to prevent any violence from happening. He just kind of fucks off and like jumps up on the roof. And, you know, it's that unfeelingness. And meanwhile, Anna and Mark are kind of both dead. Like they're kind of intense. I don't want to use the word hatred. They're kind of the intensity of their emotions kind of completely breaks them down in the end. And obviously this is all extremely heightened. So it ends with a bloody shootout, and they're both kind of dead on the stairs. And there's kind of some elements by the private investigators and Mark's work that come into play here, but they're not greatly expanded. They're just kind of these other extra forces that are there to pressure this dynamic between them. So I this time round when seeing it, I kind of really zeroed in on the idea of them kind of destroying each other because they couldn't not be together, even though they didn't want to.
They kind of destroy each other to get their happy ending in a weird way, which is a really cool ending. You're right. There's so much other stuff going on there there's a whole like car crash sequence and everything that is like I always forget about. It's really strange. They really cram a lot in to that ending. Yeah, it's a fascinating one. I'm sure some of our clever listeners will probably write in with what they think's really going on with Bob in the end there and those bombs, but who knows? Who knows?
And there's a whole scene with Heinrich's mother as well, which I'm like, what is this?
What is that? It's really such a strange film. A fascinating film. It's not a film that I can watch over and over again in succession because it's so intense. I'm going to give it a few years before I go back to it, but I absolutely love it. It's so unique. Amazing. Anna, thank you so much for joining me to discuss this film. This has been perfect.
Thank you.
I was like, there's nobody better to join me to talk about dance, horror, and Lovecraftian fuck monsters than Anna.
Yeah, that's on my business card. That's what I'm there for.
Tell us a little bit about where people can find you and what you've got going on in your podcast at the moment as well.
So I host 2 podcasts now. So there's the Final Girls podcast, which comes out every week. And we're looking at the female monsters right now. So we're looking at quite a few of the similar films, which is quite fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're going from the 30s till very recent horror that all kind of looks at supernatural lady monsters.
Nice.
So that's really fun. And I also co-host The Next Supremes, which is an American Horror Story rewatch podcast that I host with Clarice Dockery. And we're basically going episode by episode for American Horror Story. And we're just finished off season 1 and we're kicking off with season 2 in a couple of weeks. So that's Asylum, which is super
Asylum,
fun.
the best one. I love it. I love it.
Except it does have Adam Levine, which, you know, to give you a teaser, I rant about Adam Levine for about 20 minutes and the fact that I hate him.
Yeah, he's awful, isn't he? Although he does play quite an awful character in it, doesn't he? Which helps.
Yeah.
I think.
It does help. Yeah. And and then I'm always on Twitter as well with multiple things that I either write or host or appear on either podcast or written or other forms.
Amazing. Anna, thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Anna Bogutskaya. Such a pleasure to have her back on the pod, and of course it won't be long before Anna joins us again. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this incredible film. What do you think of Possession? What do you make of it? What do you think this film is really about? There's so much to unpick here. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please do get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's film and anything else horror related with fellow listeners, simply join the discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, and that can be found on Facebook. If you want to support this podcast and everything we do here, you can donate a small amount of money per month and be treated to regular bonus content. Head on over to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. And if you donate $5 per month, you will get access to bonus episodes every other week. And right now we are in the middle of our countdown of the Patreon's scariest ever moments in horror. It's such a brilliant list, and we revealed the first half of the list in last week's episode, and the final 25 will be revealed very soon. And if you're able to donate a little bit more per month, you can go up to our $10 tier, in which you get exclusive access to our bonus mini seasons. We are currently in the middle of a big rewatch of Twin Peaks over there on the $10 tier, and we are also about to start a brand new mini season with Brad Hansen and Zobo with a shotgun about extreme cinema. And me and Brad and Zobo are going to be deep diving into some of the most grotesque and disturbed movies ever made. So one more time, for access to all of that, sign up to our Patreon. That's patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. You can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Podbean, Stitcher, Acast, Libsyn, and Spotify. Please subscribe to us. Please do spread the word about us. And if you get a spare minute, if you want to support us, we would be so grateful if you could leave us a little rating or review. It helps the podcast get boosted in algorithms, which means it increases the chances of us being discovered by new listeners. Okay, onwards and upwards to another brilliant cinematic piece of mind fuckery. Next week, we are returning to the world of David Cronenberg for what is, for my money, one of his greatest cinematic achievements. Next week, I'm going to be joined by a brand new guest, Total Films' Matt Glasby, and we are going to be discussing Videodrome from 1983. Join us next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.